There is a category of human remains that should, by every biological standard, be the easiest in the world to sequence. The bodies are intact, the skin is still there, the hair is still attached, the last meal is still in the stomach. These are not fragments or powdered bone. They are people, fully formed, faces preserved so completely that expressions survived 2,000 years in the earth. Researchers who have studied these remains describe encountering them as unlike any other experience in forensic science. You do not feel like you are looking at the ancient past. You feel like you are looking at someone who died recently and happened to end up in a very unusual place. And yet when geneticists approach them with the tools that have revolutionized our understanding of ancient populations across every other corner of the world, they encounter something no other category of ancient remains produces at this scale. Almost nothing. The DNA is gone, eaten by the same chemistry that saved everything else. The bog preserves and destroys simultaneously, and what it destroys most completely is the very thing that could tell us who these people actually were. This is the story of what happens when a fragment survives, and what that fragment, in case after case, keeps revealing. For most of recorded history, the explanation seemed complete. Across the peatlands of Northern Europe, from Denmark to Ireland to the Netherlands to Northern England, hundreds of naturally preserved human remains have been emerging from the ground since the 17th century, whenever peat harvesters cut into the earth and found something unexpected looking back at them. The most famous among them have names. Tollund Man, found in 1950 in Jutland, Denmark, a noose still around his neck. Grauballe Man, uncovered in 1952 in the same region, his throat cut. Lindo Man, discovered in 1984 in Cheshire, England. Haraldskær Woman, found in 1835, initially believed to be a Viking queen. The scholarly consensus that emerged, and which P.V. Glob articulated in his 1966 book on the subject, held that they were ritual sacrifice victims. The bog was a liminal space in Iron Age Northern European religion, a threshold between the living world and whatever lay beneath it. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century AD, documented that Germanic peoples submerged the bodies of criminals and deserters in marshes. The consensus wove these threads together. These were sacrifices to fertility goddesses, offered at moments of communal crisis, placed deliberately in waters that stood between this world and the next. Here is where the settled story meets the molecule. To understand the depth of the problem, you need to know what a peat bog actually does to a human body. The chemistry of a raised peat bog is driven by sphagnum moss. As it grows and dies, it releases humic acids, creating an environment with a pH level comparable to vinegar. This acidity, combined with the near-total absence of oxygen and cold Northern European temperatures, works as a natural tanning agent. It darkens and toughens skin, preserves hair and fingernails and internal organs. It can keep a stomach and its last contents readable for 2,000 years, but that same acid is lethal to DNA. The molecules geneticists rely on to trace ancestry are composed of long, fragile chains, and acid is extraordinarily efficient at breaking those chains into pieces too small to sequence. What the bog saves with one hand, it destroys with the other. When researchers at Copenhagen's Center for Geogenetics attempted to extract DNA from Haraldskær Woman, working from a tooth and a fragment of the skull's petrous bone, they obtained human DNA at a concentration of just 0.2% of the total sample, below the threshold for reliable analysis. Tollund Man's femur attempts yielded nothing at all. The bodies look contemporary. The DNA does not. And here is where the theories begin to fracture. The dominant explanation in bog body research has always been the ritual sacrifice model, and it has genuine evidence behind it. The deaths are theatrical. Tollund Man was hanged. Grauballe Man had his throat cut so completely that it severed his trachea and esophagus. Old Krogan Man, found in Ireland, was stabbed, decapitated, and disemboweled, his nipples removed, a detail connecting to documented Irish ritual involving kingship and submission. These were not casual killings. They were performances. The fact that these individuals were placed in bogs rather than cremated, which was the standard practice for surrounding communities, suggests deliberate removal from ordinary funerary space. These were not people who died ordinary deaths, and so they could not receive ordinary endings. The evidence from Tacitus provides a first-century textual anchor, but this explanation does not tell us who these people were before they became victims. It explains the method of death. It does not explain the selection. Why were these specific individuals chosen? What made them appropriate offerings? The sacrifice theory is compelling on the how. It has almost nothing to say about the who. And the who, it turns out, is where things become genuinely strange. The second theory came not from ancient texts, but from the bodies themselves. Beginning in the 2000s, researcher Karin Frei at the National Museum of Denmark applied strontium isotope analysis to bog body remains. Strontium occurs in food and water at ratios specific to local geology, lodging in teeth and hair where it stays fixed, functioning as a chemical record of where a person lived. The results were striking. Haraldskær Woman, found in 1879, showed strontium signatures in her tissue pointing to terrain outside Denmark. Haraldskær Woman's tooth enamel suggested local origin, but the tip of her preserved hair, recording her final months, pointed toward a volcanic region consistent with central Germany or Britain. Both women had traveled substantially before they died. A researcher named Heather Gill-Firking proposed the more radical reading, that bog bodies as a category were what she called geographic outsiders, people who had not fully assimilated into the communities where they died and who ended up in the bog because of that marginal position. Not locals sacrificed for the community. Strangers, absorbed and then given back to the water. The theory had internal logic, but without DNA, it could not be tested against the genetic record. And for most famous bog bodies, the DNA was gone. Until one case, from a different part of the timeline, yielded something usable. In 2024, a team led by archaeologist Anders Fischer from the University of Gothenburg published a study in PLOS One examining Vittrup Man, skeletal remains found in a Danish bog in 1915. This individual lived not in the Iron Age, but the late Neolithic, between approximately 3,300 and 3,100 BC. Because certain bones, particularly the teeth and ankle, retained workable genetic material, the team was able to extract genome-wide data. What they found: genetically, Vittrup Man did not belong to the people among whom he died. His ancestry aligned with Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, the population that had inhabited the peninsula before farming arrived. The funnel beaker farmers surrounding him in Denmark carried a fundamentally different ancestral profile, derived from early European agricultural populations from further south. Strontium isotope analysis confirmed the genetic finding. Ratios in his tooth enamel indicated he was born in Norway or Sweden, across a sea crossing of at least 60 miles. A dietary isotope transect in one of his teeth showed his food shifting from marine hunter-gatherer sources toward agricultural produce near the end of his teenage years. He crossed the water as an adolescent. He adapted, and then he died, his skull crushed by at least 8 heavy blows. The outsider theory now had a genetic case. Here is what the outsider hypothesis, now supported by genetic evidence in at least one case, actually means on a human level. Imagine you are 15 or 16 years old, from a place with different customs. You cross a body of water. You find yourself among people who plant crops and keep animals, a way of life your own people never practiced. You learn it. You stay long enough that your diet changes, the isotopes in your body shifting to record a new geography. You are absorbed partially into a community that did not make you. And then, years later, in a moment of crisis or ceremony, the fact of your original difference becomes the thing that marks you out. Not your crimes, not your weakness, your foreignness. The thing you had almost erased through adaptation turns out to have been remembered all along. You sacrifice something meaningful. A stranger who had become familiar may be more valuable as an offering than a stranger who is always strange, because the sacrifice costs more. This is what the strontium and the DNA together are beginning to suggest. Not that these communities were more violent than we imagined, but that they were more attentive to origin, and that origin, once known, could not be fully unknown. None of this diminishes the bog bodies or the communities that placed them there. What it does is make the history more layered. These were not simply villages performing violence on their own members. They were societies navigating a world defined by constant movement. People crossed water, followed trade routes, married into distant communities, brought knowledge from one place and deposited it in another. The same period that produced the most famous bog bodies also coincided with one of the most thoroughly documented population turnovers in European prehistory. Geneticists studying ancient Danish remains have documented 2 near-complete population replacements in the preceding millennia. First by Neolithic farmers, then by steppe ancestry herders moving in from the east. The people living in the bogs of Iron Age Denmark were themselves the product of multiple absorptions, multiple moments when strangers became neighbors, and neighbors became ancestors. The bog may not have been a place of rejection. It may have been a place of recognition. A recognition that certain people carried the trace of elsewhere, and that this trace had meaning requiring ritual acknowledgement. What the DNA keeps revealing is that populations are never as bounded as the stories they tell about themselves. The 2024 Fischer study in PLOS One contains a detail that received little attention. The authors note that the dietary isotope transect of Vittrup Man's tooth shows his shift from marine to agricultural food occurred near the end of his teenage years. It means he was young enough at the crossing that his body had time to fully re-record itself in the chemistry of a new place. By the time he was killed, his bones told one story about where he was born. His stomach had been telling another story for over a decade. He was, by what he ate, a farmer. He was, by what his genes contained, a hunter from the north. Both were true simultaneously. One of them got him killed. The bog preserves the body and destroys the molecule. But sometimes, enough survives to show us that the person who ended up there was carrying 2 histories at once. History is not what a community remembers. It is what the community forgets to destroy.